Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion in human history, but newly declassified documents from 2025 show the German defeat was already sealed long before June 1941, not only because of the huge distances or Soviet manpower, but because Germany's logistics model, built for rapid strikes in small European states, failed almost at once when confronted with the scale of the Soviet Union. The shortages of fuel, equipment, and transport were permanent limitations, not temporary setbacks. Even basic obstacles like incompatible rail gauges or the mud seasons of Russia slowed every advance. What seemed like a campaign of unstoppable conquest was instead rooted in fragility from its first steps. And while German planners struggled with these realities, Europe itself was already shifting under the weight of uneasy agreements that promised stability, but only disguised approaching war. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's false calm. On August 23, 1939, Europe's governments were stunned when two states that had defined themselves as sworn enemies, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, announced a treaty of non-aggression. Newspapers carried the photographs of foreign ministers Molotov and Ribbentrop signing documents in Moscow, but the public display revealed only part of the truth. For years, both regimes had denounced one another as existential threats. Berlin cast Bolshevism as a racial and ideological poison, while Moscow depicted fascism as the spearhead of capitalist oppression. Just days before, few would have believed that Stalin and Hitler could appear aligned. Yet the pact not only bound them to refrain from attacking each other, it also included a framework of cooperation that gave each side immediate tactical advantages. What looked like an impossibility in August 1939 quickly redefined the balance of power across the continent. The treaty was accompanied by a secret protocol that reallocated eastern Poland and the Baltic territories into German and Soviet spheres of control. This confidential understanding enabled both armies to act in concert less than 2 weeks later, Wehrmacht forces pushing in from the west and Soviet troops advancing from the east. The partition of Poland followed swiftly, making clear that the pact was as much about territorial opportunism as it was about neutrality. The same arrangements confirmed that the Baltic states and segments of Romania were also to fall under Soviet sway, while Germany consolidated its hold in central Poland. The division of these lands, carried out without the consent of their inhabitants, became one of the defining demonstrations of the cynicism behind the agreement. The consequences extended beyond maps. Stalin considered the deal a form of insurance, an attempt to buy time. Still recovering from purges that had stripped his officer corps of experience and coherence, and facing industrial reorganization still underway, the Soviet leader was wary of direct conflict with Germany too soon. Intelligence estimates reaching Moscow suggested that Hitler remained focused on defeating Britain and France and would avoid the dangers of a two-front war. For Stalin, this encouraged the belief that signing with Berlin might postpone confrontation and give him space to rebuild. Factories and defense industries could be relocated eastward, out of range of bombers, while the Red Army replenished its ranks. In Stalin's view, the pact promised a breathing period in which his regime would be better positioned for the war he believed inevitable. For Hitler, the benefits were of a different order. The immediate advantage was that Germany could invade Poland without fear of Soviet resistance, ensuring that London and Paris would be the primary opponents in 1939. Just as crucial, the pact unlocked the flow of Soviet raw materials at a moment when Germany faced pressure from British blockades. Thousands of tons of foodstuffs, oil ores, and other commodities traveled west while German forces stormed through Poland and later swept across France. The Soviet economy, in effect, underwrote Hitler's campaigns of 1939 and 1940. Archives reveal that by the time German planners were drawing up timetables for an invasion of the USSR in mid-1940, deliveries of Soviet oil, grain, and metals were still crossing the frontier. One arm of the relationship was already preparing to break the pact, even as the other continued fulfilling its obligations. This duality shaped the entire arrangement. Each dictator assumed they had outmaneuvered the other. Stalin bet that Germany would not risk betrayal until the Red Army had reconstituted its strength. Hitler believed that a temporary understanding with Moscow eliminated his eastern danger long enough to secure victory in the West. Newly available Politburo records show that Stalin received multiple warnings of growing German hostility from autumn 1940 onward. But he assessed the risk differently from later wartime hindsight. He judged that the treaty gave him critical months to stockpile arms, reorganize formations, and transfer production east into the Urals. He underestimated how far Hitler was willing to gamble on open conflict, but his policy reflected calculation rather than naive trust. The partition of Poland highlighted the uneasy nature of this arrangement more clearly than any document could. Soviet and German officers literally encountered each other in the captured cities, parading in joint photographs while concealing profound suspicion. To both populations, the gestures of harmony rang hollow. In German propaganda, Bolshevism remained a mortal threat. In Soviet propaganda, friendship with Berlin was celebrated in public but privately regarded with unease. Neither side expected peace to endure. Both prepared in silence for a confrontation that would be more massive than anything Europe had yet endured. Diplomats abroad toasted the pact as a sign of stability, and newspapers in the Axis and Soviet press hailed it as proof of rational diplomacy. Yet beneath the surface, it marked only a suspension, not a resolution, of conflict. German officers drafted operational studies assuming that the Red Army could be caught unprepared, while Soviet staff reorganized defensive positions under the assumption that Hitler had every reason to avoid premature betrayal. Each leadership told itself that it controlled the calendar, and each underestimated how much the other was willing to risk. By transforming the early phases of the war into a contest fueled in part by Soviet resources, the pact only guaranteed that a later clash would escalate beyond precedent. By June 1941, the illusion collapsed. German formations crossed the very borders that had been redrawn in 1939, and Stalin's calculation that the pact offered durable protection evaporated. The territories that had served as a buffer under the secret protocol became staging grounds for Wehrmacht drives toward Minsk, Kiev, and Smolensk. What Stalin had conceived as breathing space became a liability. Populations annexed under the pact were suddenly exposed as the front lines of an invasion. For Hitler, the earlier alliance now proved useful not as diplomacy, but as preparation. The resources transferred from the Soviet Union had sustained Germany up to the moment of betrayal. Looking back, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was neither a triumph of strategy nor a path to security. It was a temporary convenience that lulled both men into believing they had solved the problem of timing. Stalin measured it in terms of months gained. Hitler measured it in terms of supplies and space to maneuver. For the millions who found themselves subject to the secret protocol's divisions, it meant dispossession and uncertainty. And the illusion of calm it projected encouraged both leaders to take risks that set the stage for an unprecedented conflict. The invasion that followed would test not only ideology and military strength, but also the practical ability of Germany to sustain such a war. As the first armored units surged into Soviet territory, a paradox began to reveal itself. The very state that had enjoyed Soviet oil, grain, and minerals in the years leading up to Barbarossa now depended on a supply system that was never designed for the vastness of its new campaign. This tension between ambition and capacity soon emerged as one of the decisive factors shaping the course of the war. Planning for a war Germany couldn't supply. It remains one of the central paradoxes of the German invasion in 1941. The Wehrmacht prepared for the most extensive land campaign in history using a logistical model never intended for such a scale. Their supply system had been designed for compact, short-lived drives across Belgium, the Netherlands, or France, countries with dense transport networks and rail gauges already compatible with German standards. Moving divisions in those environments meant short supply lines, where trucks could deliver rations and ammunition directly from depots to the front within a day. The Eastern Theater, however, stretched across thousands of kilometers of sparsely developed land, much of it with different infrastructure altogether. German officers understood these realities in broad terms, but entered the campaign planning as if sheer speed and aggression would erase such limitations. In truth, the campaign's sustainability was compromised from the very outset because preparations assumed a war too short for logistical strain to matter. Once the advance carried deep into the Soviet Union, those misplaced assumptions gave way to accumulating shortages that proved impossible to recover from. The entire plan hinged on Blitzkrieg tactics, a swift, decisive strike meant to bring the Red Army to collapse within weeks. The concept had worked in France, where the Wehrmacht's armored groups reached the Channel coast in mere days. In Russia, that same approach meant traversing over 1,000 kilometers simply to close on Moscow. Yet the planning cycle continued to operate on the model of Western campaigns. Supply branches were assured the fighting would last no more than 3 months. Deliveries of spare parts, fuel reserves, and winter clothing were not pressed as urgent because leaders assumed that by autumn, the Soviet Union would be forced to capitulate. What looked like optimism in 1940 and 1941 later revealed itself as negligence. The transportation systems and reserves required for deeper operations had not been organized, and the moment German columns rolled eastward, every additional mile magnified the stress. Once the invasion began, the mismatch grew undeniable. Armored spearheads surged across the frontier, but the units responsible for feeding them trailed far behind. German records from the supply branch show that by the third week of the operation, fuel requests went unanswered or were fulfilled days late. Formations halted not because of Soviet resistance, but because the last canisters of gasoline had been emptied. Trucks drove for hundreds of kilometers over rough, unpaved routes, breaking down in vast numbers. Even at the start, Germany did not enter the campaign as a fully motorized army. While Nazi propaganda celebrated mechanized columns, in practice the Wehrmacht relied heavily on motor transport, but still used hundreds of thousands of horses in 1941. These animals pulled roughly 2/3 of supply wagons, hauling ammunition, water, and barrels of fuel. Exhaustion among the horses accumulated quickly in the heat of summer, creating another vulnerability. The supposed mobility of German divisions was in reality chained to living creatures unable to withstand such demands. Railways could have offset the burden, but there too the assumptions collapsed. Soviet tracks were built on a broader gauge, which meant German trains could not use them until engineers physically dismantled and rebuilt the lines. The conversion process lagged far behind the army's speed. As armored groups pressed forward, they outdistanced the usable railheads by hundreds of kilometers. Supplies piled up west of the frontier because the new lines remained incomplete. By August 1941, spearhead units had advanced so far beyond their logistical base that basic rations and spare parts moved at a crawl. Infantry formations fell back on requisitioning food from civilians, stripping towns and villages for grain, while workshops dismantled wrecked vehicles to scavenge usable components. The practical results quickly filtered down to the men on the line. Soldiers began recording shortages long before the onset of winter. In diaries, they described going hungry in midsummer when regular rations failed to arrive. Ammunition had to be counted out bullet by bullet in firefights, as commanders held back reserves for future engagements. Newly released quartermaster reports show that within weeks of the campaign's start, officers were warning Berlin that the army was living from exhaustion. Truck strength dropped by nearly 40% in the first 4 months. Fuel losses during transport, through breakdowns, evaporation in leaky barrels, or seizure by partisan attacks, reached levels so significant that operational orders became detached from what could actually be done. The paradox of battlefield success worsening the supply crisis appeared almost immediately. Panzer groups achieved great encirclements, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Yet within their captured territory, German formations lacked sufficient food even to provision themselves, let alone their prisoners. Officers reported situations where guards and captives alike were starving as supply convoys failed to arrive. What looked like triumph on an operational map in practice created more mouths to feed and more strain on convoys already overloaded. In the east, distance itself was often the deadliest opponent. Every kilometer taken meant another kilometer that wagons, trucks, and rail crews had to cover, with capacity that never matched demand. Nor did the much-anticipated resources of conquered regions provide relief. German planners had assumed that occupied Soviet farmland would feed their armies. Instead, systematic scorched-earth tactics destroyed harvests before invaders could seize them. Villagers concealed supplies or had abandoned them altogether. In some areas, German officers found more ashes than grain. Local requisition thus produced meager results, and the Wehrmacht sank deeper into dependence on overstretched convoys. The outcome was a self-defeating cycle. The more territory gained, the longer the supply tail grew, and the less effective the occupation became. It is important to emphasize that these issues were not temporary problems to be corrected with more time. They reflected structural contradictions. The German economy could not produce enough trucks to replace the tens of thousands destroyed or abandoned. Rail reconstruction never kept up with the velocity of the advance. Fuel demand grew beyond what the available transport system could deliver. These shortages did not disappear with better planning. They remained constant throughout the campaign and into 1942. The invasion had been built as though the army would never need to operate far from its starting lines. When that prediction failed, there was no fallback plan. The German commanders themselves were aware of the contradictions. Reports from the field often paired descriptions of celebrated battles with blunt admissions that fuel, ammunition, and food were running out. Victories that captured Soviet armies came paired with requests for thousands of replacement trucks or for fuel that never arrived. The entire design of the attack assumed the size of France or Belgium, but thrust itself into a territory several times larger. What unfolded was a relentless exposure of the fact that Germany had mobilized men and weapons for a short, decisive war, while omitting the logistical backbone that might sustain a long one. By the end of 1941, this flaw was impossible to ignore. The advance had stalled outside major Soviet cities not only because of resistance, but because German schedules, depots, and stockpiles had collapsed under demands never met. In that sense, the supply system was not simply failing. Its limitations set the boundaries of what the German army could hope to achieve. Where materiel did not flow, victory could not be consolidated. The invasion carried the likelihood of eventual failure within it, because its foundations never matched the territory it sought to dominate. This left Germany in a position of severe contradiction, an army still capable of destroying opponents in set battles, but unable to convert those triumphs into lasting strategic control. Its own infrastructure, its reliance on animal power in a mechanized age, and its misplaced assumptions condemned it to an unwinnable contest. And while this weak link shaped the operational rhythm from the first weeks, an even broader misjudgment haunted the German leadership, the belief that their adversary was too weak to withstand such pressure. That perception, rooted in recent conflicts and ideological arrogance, proved as decisive as the supply failures that undermined every plan. Myth of a weak Soviet Union. The German leadership entered 1941 convinced that the Soviet Union was fragile. Their judgment rested heavily on what they had seen during the Soviet-Finnish Winter War of 1939–40. Soviet divisions that had looked disorganized, supply failures frequent, and casualties severe. Hitler and his planners concluded that the Red Army might be vast in numbers, but hollow in effectiveness. They believed the Soviet state survived only by force and propaganda, and that once German armies seized its major cities, the structure would collapse altogether. This was less an assessment of reality than a reflection of ideological bias, and it shaped the entire invasion plan. The reality was more complex. The Winter War's poor showing came at the height of Stalin's purges, when much of the officer corps had been removed and new commanders thrust into roles they were unprepared for. Soviet weaknesses in Finland showed the cost of that disruption, not the permanent state of the Red Army. By 1940, reforms were already in motion to rebuild command structures, reorganize formations, and modernize equipment. The Soviet government knew Germany posed the main threat, and preparations were underway even before Operation Barbarossa began. Key factories were dismantled and relocated hundreds of kilometers east to the Ural Mountains, where they were out of reach of German aircraft. This relocation of industry, vast in scope and carried out with precision planning, ensured that production not only survived the invasion, but eventually expanded. The Soviet leadership demanded enormous sacrifices to make this mobilization possible. Factories disassembled brick by brick were reassembled in the Urals or Siberia. Workers, technicians, and their families traveled with the machinery, setting up entire industrial towns overnight. Women and teenagers took up factory jobs in huge numbers, while older workers endured punishing hours to keep production running. Families lived in makeshift housing near industrial complexes so that every resource went directly into sustaining output. Instead of collapsing under the invasion, Soviet industry moved, adapted, and hardened against attack. The relocation was one of history's most ambitious logistical undertakings, and it gave the Soviet system a foundation far stronger than German planners had imagined. The results became clear by 1942. Soviet industry, initially disrupted, quickly rebounded. Tank production surged, centered on the T-34, a model that proved decisive. Its design combined durability, sloped armor, and mobility while being simple to mass produce. Where German factories produced high-performance vehicles in relatively small numbers, Soviet plants turned out T-34s in the tens of thousands. This single vehicle became a symbol of Soviet resilience and technological competence, shocking German officers when it appeared on the battlefield only months into the invasion. By the following year, Soviet armor production had surpassed Germany's by a wide margin, ensuring that battlefield losses could routinely be replaced. Artillery and aircraft followed the same pattern. Relocated factories in the Volga and Ural regions produced enormous volumes of guns, mortars, and shells. Soviet doctrine emphasized concentrated artillery bombardments, which became more feasible as production climbed. Aircraft production also exceeded expectations. By late 1942, the Soviet Union was rolling aircraft off its production lines faster than the Luftwaffe could replace losses. German reliance on complex designs caused bottlenecks, while Soviet designs emphasized efficiency and scale. War reports show that Soviet squadrons could absorb devastating raids, yet field replacements within weeks. This capacity to replenish, rooted in industrial relocation and mobilized labor, overturned the assumption that Soviet resources would exhaust themselves within months. The reality on the ground reflected these shifts. German intelligence reports written in the autumn of 1941 already expressed surprise at the sheer number of Soviet replacements appearing on the front lines. Tank losses suffered at Smolensk or Kiev were offset by reinforcements that arrived in alarming numbers. German aircraft units destroyed hundreds of Soviet fighters on the ground, only to encounter fresh squadrons weeks later. The expectation that Soviet material losses would cripple resistance proved entirely false. Each month, the Red Army stabilized its lines with new equipment drawn from factories that had been reconstituted far east of the fighting. Lend-Lease aid from the United States and Britain added another layer of resilience. Imports of trucks, jeeps, and aircraft lightened the burden on Soviet factories, allowing them to concentrate on tanks, artillery, and small arms. By shifting transport production to outside suppliers, Soviet industry could channel more resources into heavy weapons. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of Western-built vehicles helped mechanize Red Army divisions and improve mobility. But the foundation of Soviet recovery was still domestic. Relocated factories, mobilized labor, and strict central planning that ensured material reached the front lines. The German assumption that Soviet inefficiency meant wasted resources proved deadly wrong. In practice, central committees oversaw industrial relocation with meticulous coordination. Rail deliveries kept materials moving, New mines in the Urals and Central Asia supplied metals and fuel, and evacuated populations provided a vast workforce. By 1943, Soviet production dwarfed German capacity. Stalin's system, for all its brutality, had created conditions in which the state could absorb staggering losses while increasing military strength. The early months of disaster had forged the mechanisms of recovery, and the Red Army that emerged in 1942 bore little resemblance to the army humiliated in Finland. The irony is that German aggression itself accelerated Soviet mobilization. By striking in June 1941, Hitler forced the Soviet Union into a total war footing immediately. Factories that might otherwise have been modernized incrementally were ripped up and shifted east with urgency. Populations that had little direct connection to the war in 1939 found themselves living beside the machines that produced tanks and guns. Entire communities became instruments of the war effort. German officers saw this only through its effects: sudden rises in Soviet firepower, unexpected reinforcements, and the persistence of an enemy they had assumed would collapse. By contrast, Germany's own economy stagnated under poor management and inflexible assumptions. While the Soviet state exploited its depths of territory and manpower, German planning clung to the idea that victory required only speed. When that bet failed, there was no path to sustain operations against an enemy that continued to rebuild its strength. The myth of a weak Soviet Union had created false confidence, leaving Germany unprepared for a prolonged struggle. This miscalculation shaped everything that followed. Instead of a summer victory, the Wehrmacht faced an opponent capable of absorbing defeats and returning to battle with even greater capacity. The Soviet Union was not a hollow empire held together by propaganda, but an industrial power that could relocate, reorganize, and outproduce its enemy. The T, rolling off the lines in the Urals, was the clearest proof that Hitler's assumptions had been catastrophically misplaced. As the Soviets proved able to survive the initial blow and replace what had been destroyed, German commanders confronted a different question altogether: how to carry out an invasion across such vast distances when their armies were already tied to fragile supply lines. It was into this reality that German forces launched their advance in 1941, splitting their offensive into three immense thrusts that aimed to capture everything at once. The Three-Pronged Gamble. When German forces crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941, they did so in three vast thrusts: north against Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south into Ukraine. On maps, this broad offensive promised sweeping gains across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. But dispersing resources across such an enormous space only magnified the weaknesses of German logistics. The Wehrmacht lacked the transport, fuel, and cohesion to sustain three simultaneous operations at that depth. What looked like broad coverage translated into diluted striking power, leaving no single thrust able to deliver the decisive blow that German doctrine demanded. Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states with orders to capture Leningrad, cutting Soviet access to the Baltic Sea and striking a symbolic heart of the Soviet system. Yet poor terrain, stout resistance, and logistical weakness turned what had been envisioned as a rapid seizure into a prolonged siege. German planners had not anticipated the enormous manpower and supply burdens of encirclement. Reinforcements and materiel allocated to hold the blockade could not be spared for advances elsewhere. The objective that should have provided quick strategic results instead tied down strength in static warfare, sapping resources that were needed elsewhere. Army Group Center, by contrast, was the focal point of operational design, a direct drive toward Moscow. German generals understood Moscow's significance as both a communications hub and a political capital whose capture might splinter the Soviet state. Doctrine emphasized annihilation by encirclement, destroying concentrations of the Red Army along the way before striking directly at its center of gravity. But achieving this required concentrated power, not dispersion. Instead, the central thrust advanced with lengthening supply lines over poor roads and compromised rail systems. The need to support two other army groups starved it of the full logistical weight it required, setting the stage for a stalled climax outside Moscow. Army Group South had a different task: to seize Ukraine with its farmland, industrial capacity, and access to resources like coal and oil. This region loomed large in Hitler's vision, both for ideological colonization and for ensuring the Reich's economic self-sufficiency. Yet driving through Ukraine meant traversing enormous rivers, wide open spaces, and encountering unexpectedly strong Soviet resistance. The diversion of panzer units to capture the Kiev pocket made headlines across Germany with staggering numbers of prisoners taken, but it also exacted a hidden cost. By redirecting armor southward, Hitler inflicted a serious delay on the advance toward Moscow, a decision that his generals protested as recklessly undermining their best chance at a decisive victory in 1941. At first, the three thrusts looked like confidence in action, but within the German command, there was significant dissent. Senior officers warned that scattering strength over such distance crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to achieve a true battle of annihilation. Doctrine required overwhelming focus against an enemy concentration. Instead, the invasion pursued three primary objectives simultaneously, ensuring that none could receive decisive strength. Hitler's interventions compounded this. He insisted both resource-rich Ukraine and symbolic Leningrad were indispensable targets, even as his generals argued Moscow was the only prize that might end the war quickly. The result was a fractured strategy whose operational consequences soon became unavoidable. The trade-offs grew glaring by autumn. Army Group North stalled outside Leningrad, unable to finish its objective. Its presence fixed forces into a siege that consumed manpower and supplies, but offered little in return. Army Group South achieved spectacular encirclements around Kiev, destroying entire Soviet formations. Yet those victories were offset by the delay imposed on Army Group Center's advance toward Moscow. By the time panzer divisions were redirected back to the central axis, summer's window for a rapid attack was closing. The gamble to secure Ukraine's resources overrode doctrinal necessity, and the central assault moved forward weakened and behind schedule. Army Group Center's struggle for Moscow revealed how damaging these dispersals had become. Its tanks and trucks faced constant shortages of fuel and spares. The farther west the rails lagged, the more supply convoys overloaded. Reserves meant for a concentrated strike were bled away, diverted to other fronts, or trapped in endless delays. By the time German divisions closed on the capital's outskirts, temperatures had dropped, resistance stiffened, and the chance of a rapid victory evaporated. The decision to split concentration had cost the Wehrmacht the timetable on which its success depended. The logic of Blitzkrieg, decisive speed, concentrated encirclements, was well understood within the German officer corps. But the invasion of the Soviet Union represented its betrayal in practice. Instead of concentration, Hitler demanded division. Instead of clearly focusing on destroying the Soviet command center, he broadened objectives to secure resources, symbols, and ideological prizes. What resulted was the exhaustion of the supply system, the weakening of each offensive thrust, and strategic paralysis by the year's end. The soldiers at the front felt the consequences in immediate terms. Beside Leningrad, German units dug in for a blockade with winter closing in, lacking the strength to storm the city, but still bound to hold their positions. Along the road to Moscow, exhausted divisions crouched in inadequate shelters, tanks frozen in place with empty fuel tanks, rifles short of ammunition. In Ukraine, long supply lines grew vulnerable to partisan disruption as attrition set in. What had started a few months earlier as Germany's boldest offensive now revealed itself as overextension on every front. In Berlin, Hitler still insisted the advance remained within his control. To a professional soldier, however, the flaws were obvious. A strategy so dispersed it contradicted the very doctrine that had given Germany its earlier victories. Encirclements delivered massive Soviet losses in the short term, but the Soviet Union was not a small Western state. Its breadth of territory and capacity to replace armies meant those losses were not decisive. Without a blow at the center of gravity, destruction of field armies alone could not end the war. By late 1941, the three-pronged gamble had reached its limit. None of the thrusts had achieved their decisive objective. Leningrad endured despite the siege. Ukraine was occupied, but only through delays that undermined the campaign's timetable. Moscow stood unconquered, defended by fresh reserves drawn from the east, even as German divisions froze outside its gates. Supplies dwindled, morale sagged, and the strategic momentum that had defined German arms since 1939 finally broke. The gamble revealed itself not as brilliance, but as dispersal without decision. Germany held vast conquered areas, but nothing that forced Soviet collapse. The war had not been won quickly. Instead, it had become an extended struggle fought across distances that overstretched every capability of the Reich. For the soldiers trapped in worsening conditions, the failure of strategy was not an abstraction. It meant hunger, exhaustion, and the reality of being stranded deep in hostile territory. And yet, this only described part of the weight bearing on the German war effort in the East. Beyond strategy and logistics, the invasion was defined by another factor entirely: the deliberate political and ideological choices that shaped how the war would be fought on the ground. Those directives carried consequences just as profound as battlefield setbacks, and they made clear from the very beginning that this conflict could never follow the rules of conventional warfare. The Commissar order and war of annihilation. Music, unlike wars fought elsewhere, the campaign against the Soviet Union was shaped from the start by directives that revealed its intent as one of annihilation. On June 6, 1941, just 2 weeks before the invasion, the German High Command issued what became known as the Commissar order. Its instructions were blunt and explicit. Any Soviet political commissar captured with Red Army units was to be executed immediately. They were not to be treated as prisoners of war, not to receive the protections guaranteed under international agreements, but to be shot on the spot. Here, ideology defined policy. Commissars were cast as enforcers of Judeo-Bolshevism, condemned outside the law, and marked for elimination as political enemies rather than soldiers. The scale of the order's impact was immense. It led to thousands of summary executions in the first months of the invasion and transformed how Soviet prisoners of war were treated. In 1941 alone, more than 3 million Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. Most would never survive captivity, dying from starvation, exposure, disease, or direct shootings. German forces that obeyed the Commissar order blurred the line between conventional military operations and sanctioned massacre. For these units, the presence of a commissar in a captured group meant immediate separation and killing. Even those merely suspected of being commissars through appearance, education, or language were singled out. Suspicion itself became a death sentence. Archival reports made public in 2025 confirm the routine nature of these shootings. Documents describe prisoners marched a short distance from their comrades before being shot, often without questioning. Orders emphasized that tribunals or detailed identification were unnecessary. The blanket label, Commissar, sufficed, providing both the justification and the authority. For soldiers, this legitimized brutality and expanded its reach. If commissars were outside the law, then so too were those they commanded. The distinction weakened further with every act of violence, creating a culture where Soviet prisoners were treated with contempt and deliberate neglect. The consequences reached far beyond the political officers themselves. German policy towards Soviet POWs diverged radically from its treatment of captured British or French soldiers. Those taken in the West could expect rations, basic shelter, and eventual exchange. Those captured in the East were starved, beaten, or left to perish. Camps built for Soviet captives became landscapes of dying men, with mortality rates approaching levels unparalleled on other fronts. The Commissar order had opened the door to this abuse, signaling that international law no longer applied in the East. The Red Army's soldiers, from newest recruit up to Commissar, were regarded as enemies undeserving of the most basic protections. Survivor testimony brings these policies to human scale. Accounts describe prisoners forced to dig shallow trenches only to be lined up and shot at their edges. Others recall selection within the ranks, where commissars, or those assumed to be, were led away under guard and never returned. Sometimes insignia decided the matter. Sometimes it was education or even accent, with German officers believing such traits betrayed political affiliation. Innocent men disappeared under a glance. Soldiers who lived recalled decades later the horror of watching comrades killed in such fashion while being powerless to intervene. Testimonies recorded in the past few years confirm that civilians too could be targeted when suspected of being tied to political organizations, extending the violence beyond the battlefield. Administrative records captured after the war reinforce this portrait. Company and battalion leaders wrote matter-of-factly about killings conducted in accordance with orders. There was little sense of moral conflict in these documents. The tone was procedural, cataloguing executions as routine entries. This bureaucratic detachment makes clear the connection between ideology and chain of command. The killings were not rogue acts, nor occasional misconduct. They were demanded from the top, transmitted down through German formations, and institutionalized at every level. Strategically, the Commissar order carried effects that surprised even German commanders. The knowledge that commissars faced certain death stripped away any incentive for surrender. Among officers in the Red Army, fighting to the last was the only option. Ordinary soldiers, too, saw the executions as a sign that capture offered no safety. The order thus hardened resistance rather than softening it. Soviet leaders used the directive as propaganda, telling their troops that the Germans sought their extermination. For a soldier deciding whether to retreat, that message was decisive. To be taken meant risking execution from hunger or gunfire. Fighting on became the only path to survival. This feedback loop grew more visible as the campaign dragged on. German strategy relied on inducing collapse through mass encirclements that produced huge surrenders. In the West, that model had worked. In the East, the brutal treatment of captured soldiers encouraged continued resistance. By the autumn of 1941, even though the Red Army had suffered staggering losses, it did not break. Instead, Soviet units regrouped and returned. Brutality had convinced them that the stakes were total. Defeat meant death, not accommodation. Far from securing victory, the Commissar order became a factor in Germany's failure to force rapid Soviet collapse. The damage extended to the Wehrmacht's reputation long after the war. The attempt to separate regular army conduct from SS culpability falters in the evidence. Division logs, frontline reports, and operational memos reveal that implementation of the Commissar order was common across both regular and SS units. Concerns raised by some commanders that executions would stiffen Soviet resolve were noted but secondary. Official directives overrode doubts. By May 6, 1942, the High Command rescinded the order after acknowledging it was strategically counterproductive. But the suspension came too late. Tens of thousands of lives had already been taken, and the Wehrmacht was already implicated in systematic violations of international law. At Nuremberg, prosecutors treated the Commissar order as one of the clearest signs of planned criminality. Here was a written directive, originating at the highest level, instructing the army to violate law and morality as a condition of the invasion. Judges heard testimony, reviewed captured documents, and recognized that these were not isolated atrocities, but institutionalized policy. The order illuminated the nature of the Eastern Front itself, a battlefield where legality had been stripped away and ideological prerogative reigned. Military necessity had been distorted into a license for murder. Entire categories of human beings, political commissars, prisoners, civilians tied to local committees, were deemed disposable by design. What emerged was a fusion of ideology and military strategy. Conquest was no longer defined by possession of territory, but by annihilation of populations. Soldiers were drawn into a project where the line between combat and atrocity no longer existed. The Commissar order stands as one of the starkest examples of this convergence, demonstrating how frontline soldiers became instruments of ideological policy. For those trapped on the receiving end, the war became an existential struggle. For German troops, the order reshaped both their mission and their moral world, leaving legacies that endured long after 1945. The scale of violence this directive helped unleash was not confined to frontline battles and POW camps. Across occupied territories, the same ideology extended into how entire communities were treated. As the war expanded, the front blurred into the rear, and violence followed into villages, towns, and forests. Resistance, however, did not end with Soviet regular armies. It also emerged beyond the battlefield itself, taking forms the invaders were never fully prepared to control. Partisan resistance, the war behind the front. For German forces pushing further into Soviet territory, danger came not only from the front, but also from the rear. As rail convoys rolled east and garrisons settled in towns, a new opponent emerged: Soviet partisans. Operating from forests, marshes, and remote villages, these groups waged a war of sabotage that steadily eroded German control. They derailed trains, mined roads, burned supply depots, and ambushed columns moving between bases. The more ground the Wehrmacht occupied, the more its stretched rear became contested by invisible enemies targeting every weak point in the fragile supply system. This resistance was planned from the start. In July 1941, following the first weeks of invasion, Soviet leadership issued directives calling for the creation of partisan detachments and diversionist groups across occupied lands. These orders, reinforced by Communist Party officials and Komsomol activists, meant the effort was not scattered improvisation, but deliberate policy. By the end of that year, over 2,000 detachments, totaling more than 90,000 fighters, were active behind German lines. Some units were made up of soldiers cut off after encirclements, while others formed locally around civilians determined to strike at the occupiers. Together, they produced a movement that expanded with every month of the war. The effect was immediate and destabilizing. Railways critical for moving food, fuel, and ammunition east became prime targets. Entire stretches of track were blown apart, bridges demolished, and repair crews forced into cycles of endless reconstruction. For German field commanders, the consequence was constant insecurity in their own rear areas. Orders that assumed timely delivery of supplies rarely matched reality when convoys were destroyed before reaching their destinations. At times, the German command had to commit entire divisions and security battalions to deny partisans freedom of movement, diverting forces that could otherwise fight at the front. The natural environment magnified this threat. Belarus offered dense forests and marshes where small groups could vanish after a raid. In Ukraine, vast stretches of countryside concealed stockpiles of weapons and food concealed by villagers. German truck convoys often moved under escort, yet even armored wagons attached to supply trains could not prevent repeated ambushes. Journeys of a few hundred kilometers slowed to a crawl. Every delay meant another frontline formation, short of the resources it needed to fight. Reprisals became the German response. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, mass executions were carried out, and entire populations deported. But heavy-handed violence strengthened the resistance rather than breaking it. Families that had lost relatives to punishment often turned to partisans for justice. Communities driven into hunger or homelessness saw little left to lose. Even in territories with strained loyalty to Moscow, such as parts of western Ukraine, the brutality of occupation shifted local attitudes. For many civilians, supporting the partisans became the only available answer to German terror. Scale quickly became measurable in material terms. Soviet and German records confirm that by 1943, partisan warfare had destroyed tens of thousands of German vehicles, supply wagons, trucks, and even armored cars. Each represented supplies that never arrived, fuel lost, or ammunition destroyed in transit. The logistical strain already inherent in Operation Barbarossa deepened into chronic weakness. German soldiers at the front often waited days or weeks for reinforcements that had been derailed or blown apart far behind them. To stabilize the situation, the Wehrmacht diverted hundreds of thousands of troops to rear area security. Infantry meant for frontline attacks was reassigned into fragmented security companies. Special units were created for anti-partisan duties, but the threat only grew. The paradox was clear. The more men Germany committed to this hidden war, the thinner its fighting strength became against the Red Army. Campaigns that demanded concentration of force instead staggered beneath division of responsibility. German officers themselves acknowledged this, noting that offensives slowed not only because of Soviet armies in front, but because of partisan disruption behind. By 1942 and 1943, the partisan war grew increasingly coordinated. Soviet command sought to integrate sabotage with major operations at the front. Campaigns like the so-called Rail War and later Operation Concert targeted transport networks on a massive scale. These efforts, timed around frontline battles including the clashes at Kursk and Smolensk, helped immobilize German reinforcements and complicated strategic redeployment. For the first time, partisan activity was no longer isolated strikes, but theater-wide operations synchronized with the Red Army. The rail system, already overstretched, became a battleground of its own. The struggle carried moral as well as material significance. Soviet propaganda highlighted partisan exploits, spreading stories of ambushes and sabotage to show that resistance persisted everywhere, even in occupied zones far from the front. Ordinary villagers drew strength from these accounts, sustaining morale under occupation and reinforcing the expectation that collaboration would not be tolerated. For the Germans, this ideological battle became another burden. Propaganda that had promised rapid conquest now clashed with daily fear among soldiers forced to patrol forests and villages in constant uncertainty. The relationship between partisans and civilians was complicated but decisive. Civilians provided food, shelter, and intelligence, often at immense risk. In return, reprisals and German starvation policies deepened their reliance on the fighters. Supply caches hidden by peasants allowed detachments to survive brutal winters. Guides ensured German patrols could be led into ambushes. Over time, the lines between combatant and civilian blurred, making occupation policies of control increasingly untenable. German responses escalated into repeated anti-partisan sweeps. Units surrounded villages, searching for hidden fighters and punishing communities en masse. Official reports recorded thousands killed or deported, yet the problem remained. Destroyed groups simply regenerated, supplied by local networks and reinforced by Red Army soldiers filtering back from the front. A cycle developed. More violence produced more partisans, and more partisans required more violence. The Wehrmacht, already short of resources, became trapped in a counterinsurgency it could neither master nor escape. By 1943, German records reveal growing recognition of the impossibility of stability in the rear. Reports admitted that no area can be regarded as safe, acknowledging that entire provinces remained effectively outside occupation control. Security battalions faced continuous ambushes, while repair crews never caught up with damage. Even towns under heavy garrisons could be isolated by destroyed bridges and blocked rail lines. For every temporary success in clearing forests, partisans emerged in another. Control was an illusion, and by then the illusion had come at enormous cost in manpower and supplies. For Germany, this was a second war superimposed upon the first. The Wehrmacht fought the Red Army in the field while simultaneously being bled from behind. Every derailment, every mined road, every ambushed convoy chipped away at the possibility of sustaining large-scale offensives. Attacks intended for Leningrad, Moscow, or the Caucasus were slowed or weakened not only by battlefield losses, but by resources consumed in the forests of Belarus or the villages of Ukraine. The partisan war, then, was more than disruption. It was a strategic element that multiplied the difficulties Operation Barbarossa was already built upon. Victory at the front could not erase sabotage in the rear, and destruction of partisan units brought no permanent answer. The longer the occupation lasted, the wider resistance spread. For Germany, Every advance east only enlarged the territory where partisans operated and increased the demand for security. By turning every rear area into contested ground, the partisans ensured that the Wehrmacht never secured the space it had seized. Occupation looked impressive on a map, but in practice it was fragile, contested, and constantly bleeding resources. German plans counted on stability behind the lines. What they faced instead was an enemy that grew stronger as brutality deepened. Partisans turned the rear into a battlefield. Germany never secured what it had seized. The role of weather and intelligence failure. The German advance in 1941 was planned under the assumption it would be swift enough to avoid long exposure to the natural elements. Yet, as the campaign dragged on, climate and misjudgment together became decisive. The role of weather and intelligence failure can be measured in the way victory slipped from reach, even as German troops stood at the outskirts of Moscow. From the beginning, the operation was conceived as a summer war. Officers told soldiers they would be home before the leaves fell. German divisions marched with light coats, thin boots, and rations calculated for weeks, not months. Procurement officers stocked wagons with supplies fit for temperate weather, not the extremes of the Russian climate. Plans excluded insulated boots, winter coats, or cold-resistant lubricants. At the very moment of one of history's largest invasions, an entire army was prepared, as though harsh seasons simply did not exist. In June and July, the gamble seemed justified. Armored spearheads overran border defenses, encircled thousands, and pushed ever deeper. But by late September, the terrain struck back. Heavy autumn rains produced the Rasputitsa, the infamous season of mud that transformed roads into swamps and immobilized armies. Trucks lurched helplessly axle-deep, horses floundered in mudfields, and fuel drums intended for frontline delivery were abandoned along the tracks. What had been rapid encirclements turned into agonizing drags over terrain that swallowed steel and hoof alike. The mud arrived just as commanders promised Moscow could fall before winter, making that timeline impossible. German intelligence officers had long anticipated the effect of winter weather. Attachés who observed the 1939-40 winter war between Finland and the Soviet Union sent back detailed reports. They warned of lethal cold, malfunctioning engines, frostbite casualties, and the need for protective gear. These findings circulated in Berlin, but rather than being ignored outright, they were discounted. Hitler and his closest planners insisted the Eastern Campaign would be decided in a few months, rendering winter preparation unnecessary. When procurement officers raised the issue of coats or vehicle lubricants, they were advised these stocks would never be used. In hindsight, what the German command downplayed became the very conditions that shaped their downfall. By October, as temperatures dropped below freezing, frontline units discovered the magnitude of this oversight. Thin uniforms built for Central Europe were no protection against icy winds. Leather boots stiffened and cracked, leaving feet exposed to frost. Soldiers padded their legs and arms with straw or stole whatever clothing they could from prisoners and civilians. Ad hoc solutions became survival measures. Entire battalions wore pieced-together coats with mismatched buttons, evidence of an army improvising in conditions it had not been equipped for. Machines experienced the same paralysis. Fuel thickened in the cold and clogged carburetors. Oil turned viscous and forced engines to seize. Reports described tanks and trucks immobilized in open country, not because of Soviet fire, but because they would not start. Panzer crews saw the engines of their once dominant machines turn into frozen blocks of metal. To force movement, soldiers built fires beneath vehicles, risking explosions that sometimes destroyed the machines they were trying to revive. Even rifles malfunctioned when lubricants congealed in bolts. Mechanized warfare, the very strength of the Wehrmacht, was neutralized by frozen air. The toll on manpower climbed rapidly. Frostbite became one of the most common medical conditions of the war in 1941. In some units, reports show more men left the lines from exposure than from combat. Accounts describe soldiers whose fingers blackened, whose toes had to be amputated, whose faces froze as they stood watch in open positions. One survivor recalled that half his company became unfit to fight, not from Soviet bullets, but because their bodies failed under the cold. In casualty reports, frostbite by December 1941 exceeded wounds from rifles or artillery. For those in trenches, the enemy was as much the cold earth as the Red Army itself. The irony is that the Soviet troops endured the same climate, but with preparation. Fighting on home soil, they drew from depots of winter gear. Soldiers wore felt-lined boots, quilted coats, and shawls designed for precisely these conditions. Their weapons performed in the cold with oils and greases suited for sub-zero temperatures. Soviet tactics were adapted to the seasons, with experience from past wars making clear how to move and fight in snow. While Germans froze into inactivity, Soviet formations pressed counterattacks, turning nature itself into an ally. Inside the German command structure, frustration mounted. Reports arrived daily of halted units, escalating frostbite, and machines immobilized. Requests for winter gear intensified and were relayed from divisional to army to Berlin. Yet production bottlenecks meant there was no rapid way to clothe an army already half a continent away. Factories in Germany still produced according to schedules set months earlier under the expectation of a quick victory. Deliveries from occupied territories failed, since the very mud and snow they were meant to counter had blocked their transport. By November, units stared across at Moscow with no means to advance and dwindling ability even to hold position. The psychological collapse followed. Soldiers raised on promises of easy conquest now wrote letters that described constant hunger, biting winds, and the terror of falling asleep in snow without waking. Desertion rates increased where movement slowed. Commanders imposed strict discipline with harsh penalties for retreat or refusal. But coercion could not disguise a reality. Divisions starved and froze in place, even as orders for attack still arrived from above. When the Soviet counteroffensive began on 5-6 December 1941 under General Zhukov, it fell upon exhausted men with failing equipment who had already lost the battle against the climate. That counteroffensive demonstrated the convergence of weather and intelligence failure. Soviet divisions, reinforced and replenished, struck at an invader immobilized by frost. German lines bent and shattered because men could not maneuver in frozen terrain. The counterattack did not merely push them back, it revealed that the vision of seizing Moscow before winter had failed irrevocably. The loss of initiative, once surrendered, could not be reclaimed. From that moment, Germany could no longer decide the timetable of war in the East. Natural conditions had not simply slowed operations. They had crippled them, transforming advantage into paralysis. The Rasputitsa had swallowed mobility in autumn, while the winter froze weapons and men in place. Each day of exposure eroded strength Germany could not replace. Reports catalogued battalions disappearing under cold rather than combat, officers describing soldiers too numb to hold rifles. Schedules devised in June collapsed under the reality of December. By the close of 1941, the greatest army in Europe found itself checked at the gates of Moscow not only by Soviet resistance, but by seasons themselves. Mud had consumed momentum, frost and snow had broken endurance. Weather combined with misjudged intelligence assessments to end the vision of a rapid victory. The assumptions of a short campaign meant soldiers entered a war they were not equipped to endure, and the reality of Russian seasons exacted a price Germany could not afford to pay. The halt before Moscow was more than an operational setback. It revealed the fault lines running through the entire strategy. Nature and miscalculation together had stopped the drive east, forcing German leaders to reassess an enemy they had once dismissed. What had begun in confidence ended in exhaustion, with morale shaken and the promise of easy conquest broken. In the months to come, those cracks widened across multiple battlefields, where Germany attempted to impose will upon an opponent that proved more resilient with each attack. Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. The course of the Eastern Front became defined by three battles: Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. Each revealed in turn the limits of German power and the growing resilience of Soviet resistance. Together, These campaigns showed the steady progression from bold German advances to decisive setbacks that could never be undone. The siege of Leningrad began in September 1941, when Army Group North reached the city's approaches. Hitler declined to storm it outright, instead ordering it encircled and starved. He believed the collapse of civilian morale would make conquest bloodless and free up divisions for other fronts. Instead, the city endured the longest blockade in modern history, nearly 900 days of hunger, shelling, and bitter cold. German artillery pounded the city's food depots and power plants, while bombers rained destruction from the air. Starving families scoured bark and sawdust to stretch tiny rations. Civilians collapsed in the streets with crumbs of bread still in their hands. Despite this suffering, Leningrad did not surrender. Supplies reached the population through the Road of Life, across frozen Lake Ladoga, an improvised lifeline that carried food and fuel under constant bombardment. The convoys were perilous and inadequate, but even a trickle of supplies kept the city alive. Instead of saving resources, the blockade bound German divisions year after year, consuming manpower with no breakthrough. For the Soviet people, Leningrad became a symbol of endurance. For the Germans, it marked a so-called solution that dragged out into years of failure. Not until January 1944 did the Red Army break the siege, and by then the damage had spread far beyond a single city. The second decisive test came at Moscow in late 1941. German spearheads of Army Group Center had pushed so deep that advance patrols could see the towers of the Kremlin from a distance. It seemed for a moment that Hitler's gamble might succeed. Yet the advance was a shell of its former pace. Supply lines were overstretched, fuel supplies nearly empty, and troops still marched in thin summer uniforms as sub-zero temperatures set in. Engines failed in frozen fields, horses collapsed in the snow, and exhausted infantry struggled to build shelters in frozen ground. The Soviets, meanwhile, prepared their defenses with a clarity Germany lacked. Intelligence from the Far East confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia, and Stalin released fresh divisions from that theater. Siberian reinforcements arrived well-trained, fully equipped for winter fighting, and immediately entered Moscow's defenses. On 5 December 1941, Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov launched a counteroffensive. Striking exhausted and ill-prepared opponents, the Red Army pushed German units from the city's outskirts, forcing them into a full retreat. Hitler's unbeaten army had met its first decisive land defeat. The retreat outside Moscow shattered the myth of a short war and demonstrated for the first time that the Red Army could not only endure, but recover and strike back effectively. Third great struggle, Stalingrad, followed in 1942 and proved the turning point of the entire conflict. Its placement on the Volga made it a vital channel for supplies, and its name, Stalin's own, carried immense symbolic weight. Hitler demanded its capture both for strategy and pride. His Sixth Army, one of the strongest German formations, entered the city in late summer, and fighting settled into a grinding stalemate. Streets, factories, and even cellar walls became battlefields. Ruined buildings changed hands repeatedly, with both sides losing thousands of men for a few meters of ground. German artillery reduced neighborhoods to rubble, yet Soviet defenders clung to the ruins and turned every block into a fortress. By November 1942, the balance shifted. Soviet High Command launched Operation Uranus, striking the exposed German flanks that were guarded not by elite Wehrmacht units, but by weaker Romanian and Italian divisions. These outer lines collapsed under the assault, and within days, the encirclement of Stalingrad was closed. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops, including the entire German Sixth Army, were trapped inside a frozen ruin of their own making. Goering promised they could be supplied by air, but the Luftwaffe delivered only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger, frostbite, and disease took hold, tightening the circle inward. Through the winter they clung on, but by February 1943, resistance could no longer continue. Commander Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal on Hitler's orders in the hope he would die rather than surrender, chose captivity instead. His surrender marked the destruction of the Sixth Army, tens of thousands dead, and more than 90,000 marched off into Soviet prison camps, few of whom ever returned. The scale of the defeat exceeded anything seen before in modern war. An entire German field army had ceased to exist. The aura of German supremacy dissolved, and the strategic initiative passed irreversibly to the Soviets. The three battles formed an arc that defined the Eastern War. Leningrad drained German manpower year after year without forcing capitulation. Moscow exposed the limits of logistics, weather, and morale, ending the dream of a rapid victory. Stalingrad destroyed one of Germany's strongest armies outright and turned the tide of the conflict. Each clash marked a further step from German confidence to German ruin. The cost for civilians and soldiers alike was staggering. Leningrad endured mass starvation that claimed over 1 million lives. Moscow showed how entire armies could freeze and collapse when unprepared. Stalingrad demonstrated the brutal reality of industrial modern war fought to exhaustion and annihilation. Together, they forced Germany from offense into defense and from defense into retreat. After Stalingrad, there was no realistic way for Hitler's armies to regain initiative in the East. Yet the story of Barbarossa cannot be measured by campaigns alone. Behind the battles lay choices that made this war unlike others. German leaders carried with them not only maps and timetables, but ideological directives that treated whole populations as obstacles to be removed. The same policies that starved civilians in Leningrad or executed prisoners behind the lines shaped how occupation unfolded across vast territories. In the aftermath of these great battles, another dimension of the war became impossible to ignore. The way ideology itself had been written into strategy, transforming conquest into something far darker. Racial ideology becomes strategy. When the Wehrmacht crossed into the Soviet Union, it did so under orders shaped not only by strategy, but by ideology. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a racial war, one in which conquest and extermination were inseparable. Nazi leaders did not envisage the East as territory to be merely occupied. They saw it as ground to be emptied, reordered, and resettled. Populations were categorized as obstacles to be removed, whether through displacement, enslavement, or mass killing. From the start, military objectives were bound to the logic of racial hierarchy. One of the clearest expressions of this thinking was Generalplan Ost ***. Drafted by SS planners around Heinrich Himmler, it envisioned the systematic restructuring of Eastern Europe to create living space for Germans. The plan called for the removal, through expulsion, famine, or murder, of tens of millions of Slavs, Jews, and other groups deemed racially unfit. Vast swathes of land from Leningrad to the Black Sea were marked for colonization. In practice, this meant German settler communities replacing entire local populations. The plan was not rhetoric, but a detailed blueprint, calculated in numbers of people to be deported or starved. Its existence shows that extermination was not an improvisation of war, but a declared goal. Hitler's Directive No. 21, issued in December 1940, carried this ideological foundation into military planning. It called for the Red Army to be pushed beyond the Urals, with European Russia carved into zones for German settlement and exploitation. Unlike the campaigns in France or the Low Countries, where governments could be left largely intact, the East was to be transformed entirely. Occupation did not mean control of an enemy state. It meant the destruction of its people and the reordering of its territory. This fusion of ideology with battlefield strategy ensured that conventional military reasoning was repeatedly subordinated to racial objectives. Economic policy reinforced this war of annihilation. The Hunger Plan ***, developed under Herbert Backy within Goering's four-year plan, was explicit. Agricultural output from Ukraine and other occupied areas would be diverted to sustain the German Reich, while tens of millions of Soviet citizens would be left without food. The plan itself estimated famine on a scale of 20 to 30 million deaths. This was not an accident of war, but policy on paper. Starvation as a weapon to both weaken populations and sustain German conquests. In one stark sentence, German officials admitted that millions must die so that their resources could feed others. These directives shaped everyday orders for soldiers. Prisoners of war were stripped of rights from the outset. Captured British or French soldiers in earlier campaigns saw mortality rates of less than 4%. In the East, conditions were deliberately lethal. Of more than 5 million Red Army soldiers captured in 1941 and 1942, over half perished in makeshift camps, starved, frozen, or executed. Entire groups were marched into open fields designated as holding pens, where men collapsed by the thousands for lack of food or shelter. The Commissar order, already in effect, demanded executions on political grounds, reinforcing the notion that Soviet captives were not soldiers, but subhumans outside the law. The role of the Einsatzgruppen carried this fusion of ideology into full mass murder. These mobile killing squads, coordinated by the SS and supported by army logistics, followed closely on the heels of advancing formations. Their purpose was the elimination of Jewish communities, achieved through coordinated shootings known as the Holocaust by bullets. At Kamianets-Podilsky in August 1941, more than 23,600 Jews were murdered in a matter of days. Just a month later, at Babi Yar near Kiev, over 33,700 were executed in a ravine over the course of 48 hours. These massacres involved not only the SS, but also regular army support. Soldiers secured perimeters, transporting victims, or supplied ammunition. The military's complicity made these killings functionally indistinguishable from battlefield operations. For civilians, occupation policy translated into immediate dispossession. Survivor testimony from Belarus recalls village gatherings where suspected dissidents were separated and shot on the spot. In Ukraine, families reported food seizures that left entire districts to starvation as grain was shipped westward. Such acts were not isolated abuses, but deliberate enactments of racial categories. Populations classified as politically suspect or racially undesirable were slated for destruction, while those considered exploitable were driven into forced labor. The ideological vision of the occupier governed who was allowed to eat, who was worked to exhaustion, and who was shot. Sometimes ideology even overrode practical needs of the German army itself. German soldiers on the front often reported hunger, yet stockpiled Ukrainian grain was directed to the Reich before reaching those same troops. Commanders complained they lacked food for their men, but economic staffs refused to alter allocations. The priority, they argued, was to support the German homeland and ensure the starvation of local populations. As a result, frontline combat units suffered shortages while occupied villages were emptied. This was not only brutal but counterproductive, prioritizing resource extraction for the Reich, even at the expense of German units in the field, deepened rear area unrest and fostered partisan resistance, operationally self-defeating outcomes born directly of racial policy. At Leningrad, ideological orders reached an even more extreme form. German memoranda spelled out clearly that the city's population was not to be spared by surrender. The siege was not planned merely as military encirclement, but as a device of extermination. Civilians inside the city were intended to die by starvation, with no thought of relief or resettlement. Military considerations blended seamlessly with ideological demands. The elimination of millions to clear the land for imagined future colonists. This approach made plain that racial ideology was not an accessory to strategy, but its very center. Post-war studies, supplemented by newly declassified records in 2025, confirm that the Wehrmacht as an institution was thoroughly involved. Routine operational reports noted executions of commissars and the transfer of civilians for deportation. Army supply columns transporting ammunition one day and prisoners the next. Cooperation with SS units was not casual but structured, reflecting shared orders and objectives. The notion that the army stood apart from ideological violence does not align with archived correspondence or field diaries. Instead, the record shows active participation, sustained by the understanding that this was not ordinary war, but a racial campaign. The consequences of this ideological-driven strategy were double-edged. Morally, it unleashed atrocities against millions, famines engineered by design, entire Jewish communities executed in open fields, and civilian populations consigned to death or forced labor. Militarily, the same practices helped doom Germany's chances. Every railway crowded with trains transporting deportees could not carry ammunition. Every act of starvation encouraged new recruits to the partisan movement, multiplying disruptions to supply routes. Every massacre eliminated any possibility of Soviet surrender, convincing soldiers and citizens alike that defeat meant extermination. By tying conquest to genocide, the German state guaranteed not only moral collapse, but also long-term operational weakness. For Hitler, however, this was the logic of victory itself: extermination of undesirable peoples and conquest of their land as the foundation for a new German order. Barbarossa cannot be understood as a sequence of blunders in isolation, but as a war shaped deliberately by racial ideology turned into strategy. That transformation explains why brutality and destruction were not secondary consequences, but built-in intentions of the campaign. Yet these choices also hardened Germany's war into an attritional struggle it could not sustain. By 1942, the pursuit of ideological goals had drained resources, produced relentless resistance, and undermined military capacity. It tied the army to an unwinnable course even before Soviet counteroffensives grew in strength. Germany's attempt to fuse conquest with ideology had ensured its own undoing, leaving its armies to face the consequences across every battlefield still to come. Retreat and collapse. After the disaster at Stalingrad, the German army entered a phase it would never escape. The long retreat had begun, and from 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht was caught in a pattern of defensive fighting, gradual attrition, and mounting exhaustion. The loss of the Sixth Army had not simply cost men and equipment, it removed the possibility of regaining momentum. From this moment, Germany's war in the East shifted from an offensive gamble into a struggle to delay inevitable defeat. The imbalance deepened quickly. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals and running at full capacity, now outproduced Germany in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Western Lend-Lease deliveries compounded this advantage. Soviet tank and artillery production rose quickly, compounded by Western deliveries that improved Soviet mobility with trucks, locomotives, and aircraft. American vehicles carried Red Army infantry and supplies where German troops still trudged on foot or moved gear by horse-drawn wagon. For every panzer abandoned through mechanical failure or fuel shortage, new T-34s were rolling off Soviet production lines in numbers Germany could not match. What had once been a contest of rapid offensive action became a war determined by industrial arithmetic. The summer of 1943 produced a decisive demonstration of this imbalance. Hitler launched one final large-scale offensive at Kursk, the last attempt to reclaim initiative with a concentrated armored blow. The aim was to cut off the salient in Soviet lines and inflict a repeat of earlier encirclements. Yet Soviet intelligence had anticipated the strike. Months of preparation built overlapping defensive belts, minefields, and fortified positions, all backed by vast reserves of tanks and artillery. When German armor advanced in July, it drove into one of the most heavily defended zones of the war. Kursk ended with disastrous losses for the Wehrmacht. The retreat from those fortified fields confirmed what Stalingrad had declared. German offensives in the east were finished, and the Red Army would hold the strategic initiative from then on. Behind the front, the strain of attrition was felt at every level. Supply lines had been fragile since 1941, but now they collapsed under the pressure of constant losses. Divisions were forced to abandon tanks, guns, and vehicles, not because they were destroyed by Soviet fire, but because there was no fuel to move them. Trucks broke down and could not be replaced. Ammunition often failed to reach frontline units except in small, hand-carried batches. German soldiers recorded in field diaries that they hauled shells on their backs through snow because convoys never arrived. What had been poor planning in the invasion years became systemic collapse as the front lines pulled back steadily westward. Soviet confidence grew with every counteroffensive. By 1943 and 1944, deep battle operations showed new levels of coordination between infantry, armor, and air power. Breakthroughs became encirclements, and defensive lines disintegrated in a matter of hours. German units, often ordered to fortify and hold towns as strongpoints or fortresses, found themselves surrounded and cut off. Stalin's army fought with assurance, while German troops fought mainly to stave off encirclement or escape premature destruction. Between Western aid and industrial mobilization, the Red Army could keep the pressure relentless. For the Wehrmacht, retreat was compounded by leadership decisions that worsened its losses. Hitler refused to authorize timely withdrawals. He ordered ground held even when untenable, forbidding retreats until too late. The effect was devastating. Rather than pull back early to secure new positions, formations were trapped by Soviet breakthroughs and then wiped out or forced into mass surrender. Entire towns were declared fortresses, commanded to resist until destruction. What might have been managed withdrawals turned into panicked routes where soldiers left equipment, prisoners, and even comrades behind. Ideological stubbornness replaced military judgment, and the cost was destruction of units Germany could no longer replace. As material resources dwindled, morale eroded. Letters from soldiers described disappointment turning into resignation. The victories of 1940 and 1941 felt like distant myths compared to marching backwards through the same villages they had once captured. Civilians, too, saw the truth. Refugees streamed westward, wounded poured through towns, and propaganda claiming success grew hollow. Those in uniform endured partisan attacks in supposed rear areas, bitter winters without proper equipment, and the growing realization that survival rather than victory was their only remaining goal. By 1944, desertions mounted, and rumors of impending defeat spread openly through the ranks. The wider war economy worsened the position. German fuel shortages became catastrophic as Allied bombing crippled synthetic fuel plants. Every operational plan was limited by gasoline supplies that barely brought divisions into position before running dry. Aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel, and entire armored corps lost mobility regardless of their remaining tanks. At the same time, the Soviets continued to field enormous stockpiles of artillery shells and fuel provided in part by Allied aid. In a war of endurance, the side with secure resources would prevail, and Germany had none. The gradual collapse stretched across multiple fronts. In Ukraine, German armies withdrew across the Dnieper, abandoning fertile land and industrial resources they had conquered with such effort. In the north, Soviet breakthroughs drove the Germans out of the siege lines around Leningrad, ending one of the longest blockades in history. By the summer of 1944, Operation Barbarossa destroyed the bulk of Army Group Center, an offensive so comprehensive it erased entire German divisions and opened the road into Poland. Each retreat followed the same pattern: loss of ground, loss of troops, and no chance to recover. By this point, it was clear even to German officers that the foundations of their empire were crumbling. Attrition was not a temporary condition, but the permanent state of the war. Every engagement drained men and weapons that could not be replaced, while the Soviets, mobilized and reinforced, marched forward with greater confidence. Barbarossa, conceived as a war of conquest, had dissolved into a defensive struggle in which Germany ceded land month after month. The retreat was relentless, and collapse became more certain with each passing season. In the end, the retreat was more than a sequence of military defeats. It demonstrated how ideology, flawed strategy, and weak logistics had created a campaign that could not be sustained. Material shortages, catastrophic leadership decisions, and collapsing morale reinforced one another until the army became incapable of recovery. By the time Soviet troops entered Poland and the Baltic states, the only question was how long Germany could last before its defenses broke completely. The drawn-out collapse of the Wehrmacht after Stalingrad revealed that retreat was not only about losing terrain, it was about revealing the structural weaknesses that had been there all along. Tanks, men, and morale dwindled while Soviet power expanded, widening the imbalance point by point. Each stage of retreat illuminated lessons about what happens when ideology supersedes strategy and when planning ignores limits of resources and terrain. Those lessons remain visible in the ruins left behind and in the history that followed, shaping how this campaign is remembered and understood. Operation Barbarossa's collapse was rooted in its very design. Logistics built for short campaigns, the attrition of weather, partisan warfare behind the lines, and genocidal policies that hardened Soviet resistance ensured that Germany could not achieve a rapid victory. What began as a blitzkrieg degenerated into an attritional struggle that Germany's economy and army were unable to sustain. The invasion showed how ideology, when allowed to dictate objectives, can undermine even the strongest military machine. Which strategic error do you think proved most decisive? Hitler's timing, logistics, or ideology? Tell us in the comments below.